My guest today is John England, an education policy analyst at Libertas Institute in Utah. Libertas is a think tank that's part of the State Policy Network, which is a national network of free market think tanks, and I am a education policy fellow there. So it's great to have John back on the podcast after being on initially, I think about a year ago, John, talking about your transition from being a school teacher and principal in public schools in Utah for about 14 years to then joining the Libertas Institute and working on education policy. You had recently become a homeschooling dad after your kids had been in public school. Then, kind of during COVID, that shifted as it did for so many families and became a microschooling dad as well, as some of your kids are attending a microschool, and have now really been instrumental in helping to advocate educational choice and freedom in Utah and nationally. Utah last year became one of the states to implement a universal education savings account program, enabling all K-12 students in the state to be eligible for a portion of education, state allocated education funding to go to education options that they choose, including microschools and various homeschooling curriculum and supplies and tutoring and all kinds of great things. And then you've also been working on removing barriers for education entrepreneurs so that more founders can start and scale their small businesses, their micro schools or their private schools to be able to meet the growing demand from families for these innovative models that are now becoming increasingly accessible to them. So it's great to have you back on the podcast. There's a lot to talk about, including not only sort of the passage and implementation of the universal ESA, but also, and maybe we'll start here, the most recent passage of a new bill that's really a land use bill, sort of a zoning bill to try to address one of the biggest concerns, the biggest challenges that education entrepreneurs confront, and that is location and space and how to get kind of up and running, especially for micro schools, which don't fit neatly, as we know, into boxes of public or private schools and often are in this really gray zone. And so you tried to address that. So, John, maybe let's start there. First, welcome to the podcast again. And love to start with sort of the evolution of this zoning bill to make it easier for microschool founders. Tell us the history of that bill and kind of where we're at now with it.
Yeah. So actually and by the way, it's great to be on again. I always enjoy being on your podcast and listening to all the amazing microschool founders that you bring on. But yeah, so this actually all came from 2022 in August. You were there actually. We had a convening with Utah microschool founders and other innovators in the state. And we just brought them together and said, what are the issues that you're facing and where can Libertas as a policy entity working with the state legislature help? And one of the big things that came out were two things that they run into where the government really gets in their way, which is zoning laws, where they can put their schools, and then building occupancy is the second one, which is what does their building have to look like when they move into it? And those have been the big things that founders across the nation, as I've talked to them, as I've listened to your podcast, as I've met with other people who are working with founders, they say that's where the government really gets in the way of innovation across the country.
So what happened next then, John, from that kind of convening of entrepreneurs, really solidifying the fact that zoning and occupancy tend to be headaches for especially microschool founders because, again, they're often working in these permissionless spaces. What happened after that?
Yeah. So what happened after that is I started working on policy. I started looking at the policy. What is it that's out there? And in Utah, currently for public schools and charter schools, they're permitted in all zones. And so that was the first thing I was like, well, why can't we just do that for these micro schools? Let's make them permitted in all zones so that they can be in the neighborhoods where they want to be. And that would solve one of the big problems, right? So I started.
Because typically they're forced to be in commercial zones. Is that right?
Yeah, typically they're forced to be in commercial zones. So one microschool founder here in Utah was, as he's looking for a new space, they've outgrown their current space, went to different cities, and they're really ended up being relegated to really heavy traffic areas on highways, or into, mini malls, right?
Mm.
Just these places where you get like these all these different businesses, and so they really get relegated there. And so allowing them to be in these different places would open up where they could be. Some of them want to create farm schools. So that means
Mm.
that they would need to be in agricultural zones. And, if I could wave my magic wand, I would do away with zoning and be like, look, you can build whatever you want on your property, but, I live in the real world too, so I can't do that. So we had to work with the legislators on that. And then the other thing we notice is that a lot of these micro school founders have to, once they find these places and they're built to commercial standards or commercial buildings, they usually have to go in and renovate them to bring up to school standards. And these school standards are designed for schools that have a high density population. They're putting 30, 40 kids in a classroom. Micro schools typically don't do that. They're much smaller in class size. And they like a lot more space because they're usually more active, not all of them. And so being able to be in a space that fits their needs and doesn't cause them to go in and do these really expensive renovations is a really important thing.
Yes.
Yeah, go
Well,
ahead.
I just love to pause there and dig into that a little bit more, because what you're saying is, you could have these modern, maybe even new commercial buildings, like office spaces, for example, that are, fully up to code for, say, a bunch of adults working there in their offices during the day. But as soon as you say that you want to hold a micro school there or some other kind of educational entity, now all of a sudden you're expected to add on all of these other comply with all these other codes, or add in additional sprinkler systems, or who knows what, to keep up with these regulations. Is that what you were seeing happening?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what we're seeing happening. One micro school founder in Utah, St. George in southern Utah, he estimates he spent over $500,000 to get his micro school up and off the ground, and that's due to, again, zoning and building occupancy laws. So for
Mm.
zoning, he got delays and delays, and so the cost of goods went up as he was trying to get these different things up and going. And then as he went into finally found a space. It took him over a year to find an actual location with the city, that he then had to do these extensive renovations. It was an older home. He had to go and put sprinklers and exits and fire extinguishers and all these different things to update the building to beyond what a commercial building would normally.
Mm. Yeah. And this is particularly important now, with the fact that Utah passed this universal ESA program. If it's so difficult for founders to get up and running because of zoning and occupancy challenges, then it's going to artificially limit supply and make it more difficult for families to find just the right educational fit for their children, because it's difficult for entrepreneurs to operate. So this new zoning bill went through the legislature this past session and passed. What does that mean now?
So what that does, it does two important things. Again, it permits them in all zones. It allows for these micro schools to be in all zones. There's one up in a very rural area that we're having problems with zoning, so now it can be in this rural area, in this agricultural zone. The other thing it does, and this is not one that we necessarily always talk about, but some micro school founders, they just are starting them out of their homes, right? Well, currently in law, and it ends up being based on like daycare laws, they're limited to 5 students, which is okay in some instances. Maybe they only want 5 students, but some want maybe 10 students or 12 students in their homes. And so we were able to push that number up to 16 students in out of a home.
Mm.
We said that they can't require anything different from out of a home, except they have to have 2 exits, and that can include a regular window that you would have in a regular residential home, and being able to have those 2 spaces available in the home and in the commercial spaces. So it really depends on what types of micro schools they're founding. Maybe it's a small one like Prenda, or those other ones. I think Kipod's also a very small scale type micro school, and they just do them out of their homes. So
Mm.
this makes it easier for them to get up and going.
So one of the sort of concerns with any kind of legislation like this is, it could be good intentions, but does it open up, possibilities for additional regulation down the road, or could it create additional, headaches for founders? And one of the issues that sometimes comes up is with any kind of legislation, it often leads to defining the entity that you're trying to protect and trying to encourage. In this case, microschools. Did you, or I guess, how did you approach the definition of microschools for this particular bill? And, maybe what are your thoughts on sort of making sure that, this doesn't lean down a path that could be more problematic for founders down the road?
And that's a valid argument. A lot of people have said that, the minute you define something, you all of a sudden open it up to certain sets of regulations. The truth is that this movement is going to go one of two ways. And I think it's going to go this first way that I'll describe, which is that it's going to explode. And there's going to be a lot of these across the nation. And already there's a lot of them in your neighborhood, right? Things like homeschool co-ops are almost fit into this, right?
Hmm.
And so we really worked hard with homeschool leaders. We worked actually with the cities and towns and said, look, these things are coming. Help us make it easy so that they can get started, but also meet your needs. I mean, we didn't get everything we wanted, I'll be honest, but we got a lot of what we wanted. And then working with them, we were able to protect homeschoolers with the law and the definition. We made sure that it excluded the homeschoolers in everything that we did. And then we were able to expand it for those who are trying to do this as a business is really where we're trying to do it. But yeah, there is always going to be a danger in defining something because then it's in law and therefore you have to go in and go through the process if you want to change that. And that can be a daunting process for sure.
And you said it could go another way.
Oh, yes. And it could go the other way. It either fizzles out and goes away, right? And I don't think it's going that way.
Right.
Um, there's a lot of clamoring for something different. It's not even necessarily a better version of the public schools that they're looking for. Parents are looking for something different. There was an article or a research put out by Mike McShane, who's with Ed Choice, which is a national group. And one of the big things that parents mentioned is that they're looking for micro schools and these small schools at a much higher rate than they are for even a traditional private school, based on the information that I saw in that quick article and data that he put out there. And so parents are looking for something new, and so we need to provide a path, making it easier for those that want to follow. And not everybody wants to just do it and hope that they don't get caught, right?
Right.
Some people want to, they try to follow the rules. They're trying to change education, not necessarily zoning laws. So we just want to make it easier for them in that way.
Yeah, so you have the 16 learners in the home. You also sort of, again, sort of define microschools broadly as, was it 100 students in
Yes.
a space? Tell us about that.
And that, again, that all becomes part of the negotiation process when we're working with legislators. We did, again, they're micro, so we're talking about small schools. So and really this law was intended to help people get up and started, right?
Mm.
Making it as easy as possible to get up and started. Once they're up and started, we're going to run into more barriers that we're going to have to knock down. But for those initial starting up processes, we wanted to make it as easy as possible as we could. So we really tried to knock down the barriers for those who are starting this journey.
Yeah, yeah. And I think 100 learners is fair. It may not be micro the way some folks think of it, but I often find that it's micro school founders who self-identify, right? They may even have a little over 100 learners, but they'll still call themselves a micro school for other reasons. Maybe they have a highly personalized curriculum, they're low cost, maybe they're serving homeschoolers. And that kind of micro school term fits them better than a traditional private school. I think this is also really useful, John, because I hear from founders who'll say, for example, that they want to grow, they want to open multiple micro schools that say maybe only have 20, 25 students per micro school, so that they can continue with that small learning setting, but they run up into challenges with location and space. And so they end up being sort of forced to become bigger in one location because it's such a hassle to open another location. And hopefully this will alleviate that and actually lead to the greater spread of microschools and these small personalized learning models.
Yeah, and
Which,
that's
yeah.
definitely tension with everything that we're working on.
Yeah, so that brings me to sort of my next question, which is another policy brief that you put out recently through Libertas that ties in very nicely with this zoning law, and that is sort of looking at education differently, looking at education unleashed, I think it's called in Utah, and kind of your vision and what you're seeing on the ground there of what families are really looking for and what the possibilities are. I wonder if you can talk about that.
Yeah, and that just comes to the changing nature of education. We've seen it since 2020 and the school shutdowns that parents are wanting something different. They're realizing that maybe education can look different. Since 2020, there's been a big boost in homeschool. The micro school founders have uh, multiplied year over year. We're seeing more and more of them as they come about, and it comes down to this changing nature of education. You and I were both in a forum just last weekend talking about these different micro schools and hybrid schools and things that are happening differently. Again, we're seeing research that parents are okay if their kids aren't in school 5 days a week for 6 to 7 hours a day. They would like to have 1 or 2 days at home with their children. My kids go to a micro school that's only 3 days a week, and then we spend the other 2 days doing other things. There's a micro school that's a homeschool support, and they'll do 2 days a week of school, and they'll have two different sections. And so the nature of education is changing as the nature of work has changed since 2020, where, a lot of us are hybrid. You and I think, are both right now in our homes working, right? That was not something I did before 2020. And a lot of people are working some of the time from home. And that means, hey, maybe I'd like to have my kids around and we can, I can take my work on the road. I can take school on the road and we can go see these amazing things. In Utah, we have 5 national parks. How amazing is it that I can take my kids to a national park, leave on a Thursday, come back on a Monday, and I can work through the weekend if I need to, and my kids can do their schoolwork from the micro school that they need to. It's just addresses that changing nature of education that we're seeing today.
Yeah, and that change, as you've mentioned, was also sort of a personal change for you with your work and for your family. I wonder if you could take us back to your decision to leave the conventional classroom. What were you seeing as a conventional educator that was maybe making you a little bit frustrated, disenfranchised, eager for something new? And then how did that then translate to changes for your children?
Yeah, one of the things that we noticed is that, we didn't feel like the public school system was fitting our children as well anymore. We were seeing that, we sent our second oldest to the junior high, and she was being put into all these classes with a huge group of students, and her personality was wilting, honestly, is kind of how we felt. It just wasn't a good fit for her. So after that first year of her being in junior high, she's currently a 10th grader. That was in 7th grade that we experienced that. We pulled her back, and we found a micro school close by. My wife started homeschooling our children that year, and we've never looked back. We've loved it. We've loved being able to go in, and we're learning continually, and it makes us excited. And I think that excitement is trickling down to our students as well as we're learning these cool things. In fact, right now, before I came in here, my wife is out there talking about, the different parts of the human body and how amazing they are, talking about eyesight and hearing and all these different things. And the kids are excited. They're into it and they're enjoying it. And they're just, my wife and 2 of them just sitting there, my 2 youngest. And it's a joy. And I can go out and I can now have lunch with them whenever I want to. If they need help with math, they can come in and take some time with me and I can help them out right away. It's been a really great experience and transition for us because we're able to individualize it. All of our children are different. My oldest is into dancing. She loves doing hair and makeup and nails and stuff like that. So she got her nail tech certificate. She's looking at how can I use this to build my own business. My second oldest loves writing. And so she spends all on Saturdays, she's writing stories because she loves it. And that's how you and I operate, right? We operate in a way, we learn the things that we're passionate about at the time. And that's just how adults learn, and that's how kids should learn too.
So, what about you, John? As a conventional public school teacher and administrator, were you interested in homeschooling then? Did you, ever imagine that you would be kind of pursuing alternative education options for your kids, or what was your impression of those alternatives when you were in the system compared to now?
Yeah, so my impression of homeschooling was that it was inferior to the public school system, but I was wrong. I've seen the error of my ways, and I feel I've corrected that. I've always been a supporter of a parent having a choice to educate their children however they choose. That's something I've always had a belief in. I remember one of my very first year as a teacher that the local teachers union organization was talking to me because like I wasn't part of the union, and they asked me why. I'm like, well, I don't agree with your politics. I mean, as parents, we're allowed to choose what we drive, we're allowed to choose where we work, we're allowed to choose where we live. Why shouldn't parents be able to choose where their children are educated? That makes sense to me. Like that's a far more important decision than any of the other three in my mind. And so I've always been a supporter of that. But yeah, since then I'm realizing that my uh, experience with homeschoolers was definitely tainted because the ones that I interacted with were the ones that homeschooling didn't work for them. They would show up to school as a fifth grader, sixth grader, and they didn't know their ABCs, right? Things like that, where maybe the parents were they were struggling for some reason, right? And so it didn't work for them. So definitely my view of homeschooling was skewed. But since then, I've realized there is such a big and exciting way to educate. One of the first things that I noticed as I transitioned from being in the traditional schools to my current position is my creativity of how education can look started coming back to me from my first year of teaching. A one size fits all doesn't work for teachers either. There's a very creative path that teachers have, and it's amazing to see them create these micro schools that fit their dreams that they had as a first year teacher of how they were going to change the world, and now they're going out and they're doing it through these micro schools.
I remember being struck by something you said in our first podcast episode, John, which was that you were in the U.S. Marine Corps and you felt more micromanaged in the public school system as a teacher and administrator than you did in the U.S. Marine Corps. That just feeling that your creativity was stifled in that environment, and great to see that come out for you now and reflect on your children as well.
Yeah,
I want,
that's
yeah.
definitely a true thing that happened. I definitely felt more micromanaged there. And if you think about, I mean, you got laws at the federal level, then you got the federal Department of Education, then you got the state level and the state Department of Education, then you get the local district, and then you get the local principal, and they're all making rules about how the classroom should run. And there's a lot of rules about how public schools should be run.
So give us a snapshot of where Utah is right now with the implementation of its universal ESA. What is the demand like? Where do you feel like supply is in relation to that demand, and kind of where are we going?
Yeah, I think first of all, I want to put a big shout out to the Utah Education Fits All group. They've done such an amazing job of gathering parents and getting them ready for this. I worked with them finding founders and other education opportunities to be ready to hand off to the actual Utah Fits All program. And they did a great job of building up a list of over 30,000 students being ready. And so in the first weekend, they had over 10,000 students apply for the scholarship, blowing out expectations. And so implementation is going well. The website's going well for the program manager, the one who is actually administering the scholarship for parents. We're definitely looking to get more micro schools and other education options on their pre-approved list because that'll make it easier for parents to spend the Utah Fits All scholarship. If it's already pre-approved, they don't have to worry about that approval process. And so But implementation is going really well. It seems to be going really smoothly here in Utah, and I'm really grateful for that.
That's so great. And what are the details of the scholarship? How much do families get, and what can they use the funds for?
So families can each child would be given $8,000 that receives the scholarship. We currently have a limit on based on funding, so we only have enough funding to cover about 10,000 scholarships in the state, which is not enough. We
Because you had 30,000 that applied. Is that what you're saying?
30,000 on the email list. Currently, we
Wow.
have over 10,000 students who have applied, so we've already met that
Wow.
amount. So we definitely need more funding to meet the demand for that.
Yeah.
But parents can use it however they'd like to. They can use it on a traditional private school and pay tuition that way, and many do. But they can also use it as kind of the pseudo homeschooling. I'm very careful to make sure that I don't call it homeschooling
Hmm.
because that's a legal definition, right? And I don't want to mess with that. But these scholarship recipients can home educate. They can go out and they can find a tutor. They can find, interest-based lessons for their children, whether that's violin lessons or whether that's swimming or whatever it is, they can find those lessons and they can use it to buy curriculum. They can use it to buy, the things that you would use in a school at all, like printers and paper and ink and all those things to run a school out of your home if you wanted to, for your own child in a homeschooling manner. So um, the sky is really the limit. I mean, obviously, there's probably going to be some things that get limited, which I don't necessarily love, but it's definitely more free than what we currently have.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that legal designation of homeschoolers. Colleen Horanchek, our colleague at the Cato Institute, um, has this wonderful paper out about needing a firewall for homeschoolers regarding ESA and school choice programs to really enable those independent homeschoolers who want nothing to do with any kind of taxpayer funding to be separate from and distinct from any of these programs. And so that's how Utah has been able to set up their program, and many other states as well, so that you might call yourself a homeschooler if you're, participating in, for example, the Utah ESA program, but you're not technically a homeschooler. You are an ESA. I guess, how do you call it? ESA home
I think
learner or something? Yeah.
yeah, a home-based ESA scholarship.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's all kinds of legal stuff that they put into those bills, but there is definitely a distinction between what they're called. So really, it's a scholarship recipient versus a homeschool student. So
Yeah.
some are home-based scholarship recipients, others are going to private schools.
And so some critics often say, well, if we have such a free program, meaning, open to all kinds of different definitions of education and all sorts of different options to families, what if families choose wrong? What if they pick a micro school that isn't high quality? What if they spend their money on, things that we don't think are high quality? What are your responses to some of those criticisms?
Who gets to define what's high quality? Right? I mean, at the end of the day, who gets to define that? Really, it's the parents and the students working together. Like I said, I've got 5 kids. I was also an elementary principal. There are a lot of kids that don't fit into the public system. Each of my 5 kids are very different. Their needs and what is a good and great education for them are very different. If I put my oldest child into the writing regime that my second child's in, she would hate it. She would fail because she hates to write. She just doesn't like it. If I put my second child into, something that dealt with dance and the other creative things that my oldest is in, she would hate it and she would fail. And so, what makes something great is something that helps the child, maximize their potential, you know, meets their interests. Really, that's what it is. And if a parent sends their kids to a micro school that they don't like, they have the ability to pull them out and send them to a different one. That's true accountability. We saw something like that in West Virginia, right? There was a micro school that parents didn't like. They pulled all their kids out of it and the micro school failed. That's what accountability is. But that doesn't happen in the public system. Instead, they get more money, they get more supports is what they call them, right? To try and make them not a failing school, but they don't just let the school fail. And that's what the accountability really is, and what a good education really is.
So where do you see this going, John, both in Utah and nationwide in terms of not only school choice policies, but the sort of education entrepreneurship that is occurring in states like Utah with robust school choice policies, but also occurring here in, places like where I am in Massachusetts that doesn't have robust school choice. Where do you see all of this going?
I honestly see this starting to explode across the nation as parents realize that they can have something different, and they can have something different for each of their children. Um, if you have more than one child, you know that no two children are the same, and I really do see this being primed right now. I think the market's ready. We're seeing education choice policies being passed across the nation. Alabama just passed one not too long ago. And so really it's this idea that I think it's going to explode. Teachers are ready to try something different. Parents are ready to look for something different for their children. And when those things happen, we're going to see this beautiful uh, plethora of different education models that will explode across the nation.
Yeah, I've had the great privilege of being able to interview several education entrepreneurs and founders from Utah. I'm curious what you're seeing in terms of newcomers, people who are getting ready to launch, especially as the Universal ESA gets implemented. What are they like? What are some of their motivations, their backgrounds? What are you seeing on the ground there?
Yeah, and there's really two types. There's a parent who wants something different for one of their children, or there's a teacher who wants to try all these creative ideas they've had. And both are out there, and both are looking to start micro schools here in the state. That's really what we're seeing, and there are quite a few. I don't know if we'll have quite enough to meet the demand that is being generated from having the ESA passed, but the supply is starting to catch up. I think here in Utah, as getting ready for next year as the ESA will launch, and then there's going to be a whole lot of micro schools that will launch as well.
And now it's easier for them thanks to this new zoning and occupancy bill that you were championing and that the folks at Libertas were very much a part of. So, again, congrats on that. John, what is the best way for my listeners and viewers to follow you and connect with your work?
I put a lot of my work out on Twitter, so you can follow me there at jengland1226, or you can email me at Jon at libertas.org. Libertas.org is where a lot of my writings are, as well as the policy brief that you mentioned as well.
Great. And I will put these links in the show notes. And always great to talk with you, John. Thank you so much for being on the Liberated podcast.
Thanks for having me on.